Good morning. Welcome to the Institute. This is one of the many events we're doing this semester here in the Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs. My name is Nasser Yassin. I'm the Director of Research and I teach public policy in the School of Public Health. So I'm glad to have you all in this morning. We're glad to be launching the World Bank report on the toll of war in Syria. That's a key issue we've been addressing here in the Institute for the last couple of years, mostly on the refugee question, but also increasingly on the future of Syria. So we're glad to have Haroon presenting the presentation and to have Mr. Sarouj Komar also giving his view, but also presenting some kind of background overview of the report, and of course Dr. Maha Mejia, whom I'll introduce in a few minutes, bringing in her perspective as discussant of the presentation. But before I start, I'll just comment in a couple of minutes. I think in the report has been designed in a very rigorous way, using innovative methods and trying to address in a very tough context and terrain while the conflict and the war is still continuing in Syria. But I think the key thing that perhaps I only briefly read it, didn't see how we're going to rebuild Syria when the scars of the conflict continue to be entrenched more and more within the society and within the societies in Syria. But more interestingly, what's the nature of this reconstruction when tyranny is in place, when tyranny continues to be in place, from different forms and phases of tyranny in Syria? How reconstruction can happen in such context, which in my opinion is very futile as an initiative, as an exercise to do in the presence of the different forms of tyranny in Syria. But let me first give the floor to Mr. Sarouj Komar. Mr. Komar, he's assumed his position as the new World Bank Regional Director for the Mashriq, with a mandate spanning from Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Good luck for the... he's an Indian national. He brings to the region a vast experience in a critical period of transition. He previously headed the bank's Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Unit, and before then he was the Director for Central Asia. In his Middle East position, the top priorities will be first maintaining a dialogue with all the stakeholders to provide overall strategic leadership for the bank's engagement in line with the region's emphasis on job creation, sustainable growth, inclusion, and governance. And secondly, developing a strong analytical program that can inform policy and investment choices. And third, building effective integrated country teams to ensure efficient and high quality support for the client focused on results. So as you see, it's not the easiest region, but it's also challenging, and I think we welcome you, Sarouj, in AUB, but also in the region. So I'll give you a few minutes just to give an overview of the study, and then we'll move to Haroon.
Thank you very much, Nasir. I really want to thank the Issam Faris Institute of Public Policy and International Affairs for hosting the World Bank team today for the launch of this report, which is essentially the economic and social impact of the conflict. My colleague Haroon, senior economist, who's the lead author of the report, he'll go into the details. But I just wanted to give you this because this is my first visit to the university, and we are in Beirut, in Lebanon, so it's very important that I give you the context before we go into Syria. The World Bank Group essentially has twin goals, which is about alleviating poverty and boosting shared prosperity. And we want to achieve both by creating more jobs for the Lebanese people here. In Jordan, when we work, it about Jordanians. We want to help the countries to grow in a manner which is inclusive, which is sustainable, and it creates economic opportunities, creates more and better jobs. This will remain a very strong focus during my term when I'm working in Lebanon. We are already engaged in a very productive conversation with the government, with the businesses, and I also invite you to have a discussion with us how can we really work together to create more economic opportunities for the Lebanese people in Lebanon? It's extremely important. The number of World Bank colleagues in the room, they can give you more details, but that's a very big part of my commitment and my focus. I've conveyed this to the authorities here. The second I wanted to mention is about the spotlight on women. The female labor participation in Lebanon, but other countries which I'm covering in my mandate, is extremely low. And the economists will tell you that that doesn't make an economic sense when only 15% people participate in the broader economic activities in a country. So I think we got to really work together, put the spotlight on women and see what we can really do to look at the social, cultural, policy, financing questions, the broader ecosystem, so that the women can more actively engage in the broader development agenda. And this is something we are going to look at it very closely. And the third is I want to close by saying that the focus on what I call private sector development. You know, the investment needs in many of the countries to grow, the infrastructure that you need, modernizing your roads, your railroads, your airports, the whole infrastructure, it needs a lot of resources. Governments are not going to be able to do all that. You got to create the space to bring private sector. Lebanon has recently passed, as you know, a public-private partnership law, and we are very keen to work with the government and support them to mobilize private investment in upgrading Lebanon's infrastructure, which will also help create jobs. So I think creating that space for private sector is extremely important. Now, why am I saying this? Because the World Bank is a development institution. We are not a humanitarian organization. We do not provide short-term assistance. We work on long-term socio-economic development issues. And this brings me to the Syria question. In Syria, our current mandate is limited to monitoring of the conflict and its impact. We do not have any operational engagement in Syria. We are not doing any projects in Syria. What we are essentially doing is to look at how we can better understand the social and economic impact of the conflict. And this report essentially is one of the products. And hopefully going forward, we can partner with this institution here and other think tanks to see what kind of analytical work would be useful to shape whenever there is an agreement on Syria, to see what the rebuilding would look like and what contribution the countries in the region and international partners can make in shaping that future. So with those kind of introductory words, let me hand over to Harun, who is our senior economist. He'll take you through the presentation. I've been with him for the last 4 days with presentations in Jordan, in Europe. We did Brussels and London as well. And we literally flew in this morning on Middle East Airlines very early morning. But I think the topic is so important that I cannot just not engage with all of you on this and see what the role World Bank Group can play on this. So Harun, please go ahead.
So maybe I'll introduce Harun just briefly on the... Harun Onder is the lead author of the study we're presenting today. That's the most recent World Bank report on the conflict in Syria. Harun is a Turkish national, and his previous experience covered the economics of conflicts and forced displacement, issues related to international trade, economic implications of demographic transitions, and challenges faced by natural resource-rich economies, with applications in a large number of countries in Africa, Europe, and Latin America, and is currently the bank's senior economist in the Middle East and North Africa. So Harun will have 20 minutes, and then we'll give the floor to Maha to comment on the study, and of course to Mr. Saroj.
Thank you. I'll stand so that I don't sleep after the long night of flight. Thank you very much for coming today. This study we conducted between December 2016 and March 2017. So any events that may have happened since then is not covered by this study. As Saroj mentioned, the study has a completely backward-looking methodology. So we tried to assess the economic and the social impact of the conflict between 2011 and early 2017. We did not explicitly try to analyze what form of reconstruction or re-engagement might be needed. That's left for future studies. So please evaluate this study as a backward-looking and trying to understand what has been the impact, and we just stopped there. I'll briefly give you some background about the study, how we came about it, and what kind of methodologies that we used. And in terms of content, the first substantial component is what we call the wrath of war. And this is where we take a stock of the outcomes within Syria that can be attributed or that can be associated with the conflict. And these outcomes, we clustered them in 3 categories: the physical damages, humanitarian outcomes, and economic consequences. I should also remind you that this study is the first time the World Bank actually looks into the effects of the conflict within Syria. We previously performed several other studies. One was the economic effect of refugees in Lebanon. It was, I think, 2013. And then another was the economic and social impact of refugees in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. But in this study, we look what happened within Syria. The third section is probably more unconventional. Typically, when you see other economic and social impact analysis, you take a stock of the impacts, and then that is the assessment. But here we try to go a bit further. We criticize ourselves, our own methodology. We said there should be some more understanding should be coming out of this. And we try to make sense of these 3 broad effects, and we try to understand what are the relationship between the outcomes in different areas. And hopefully you'll find our results interesting. So I'll start with the background of ESIA, the Economic and Social Impact Analysis. So this picture is the central mosque in Aleppo, obviously before the conflict. Before any further ado, I should tell you that although this is a World Bank report, it's not a World Bank report. It's a report produced by many agencies. A lot of people contributed to this work. We had tens of organizations that are part of this work. We had 70 people in the team, so I'm just representing this team here. State and Peace Building Fund, all UN agencies, the European Space Agency, some civil society organizations like the Syrian Center for Policy Research and also REACH Initiative, they were part of this study. And the reason why we have so many people and so many studies in this report is because it's not easy to perform this analysis. This is an ongoing conflict. There is shortages in data. And in many cases, you either don't have data or you have too much data. What I mean by too much data is that estimates vary across organizations. You don't know which one to rely on. So what we did is that, and as Saroj mentioned, we did not travel to Syria for this study. What we did was we used our partner agencies' data, especially UN, who has an on-the-ground presence in Syria. And then we combined that with publicly available data. And finally, we used some remote sensing techniques, which is pretty much satellite imagery, to see the physical damages. And then we combined all these 3 groups of data to produce sector-based analysis. And if you are not familiar with World Bank sectors, they're all there. So in every sector that World Bank operates in, we have a background report. And finally, we synthesized this background reports to produce the toll of war, which you either have a copy or you have a link to the report. All right, so before I bore you with methodological and technical details, I will give you a snapshot of what we found. And after that, I'll go into more detailed assessments. The first group of outcomes, the stock taking of outcomes here, is that humanitarian effects. We unfortunately do not have a more recent official estimate from UN, but the latest one was the 400,000. That was April 2016. Obviously, much has happened since then, and we would only expect this devastating outcome to be worse right now. We know that more than half of Syria's pre-conflict population is displaced now. Estimates vary, but according to IOM, 5.7 million IDPs, and then UNHCR reports 4.9 million refugees. In this report, we estimated that among the surviving Syrians in Syria, 6 out of 10 live in extreme poverty now. And UN previously reported that about 200,000 births delivered in unsafe conditions annually. Unfortunately, this humanitarian effects list is very long. You can go on listing the indicators one after the other one, and it is quite a devastating situation. We couldn't talk about all here, but in the report we have more detailed assessments. The second group of outcomes that I would like to talk today is the physical destruction. I mentioned that we use the satellite-based imagery to assess to what extent the country's infrastructure and buildings, the built assets, have been destroyed. I can report that about 20% housing units have been partially damaged and 7% completely destroyed. The damage ratio is much higher in the medical facilities and also in schools. About half of the medical facilities have been partially damaged and 16% destroyed. Again, about half of schools have been partially damaged and about 10% destroyed. The third group of outcomes that we can associate with the conflict is the economic consequences. Syrians suffered not because only there were casualties and physical destruction took place, but also they suffered huge income losses. And our estimates show that the GDP in Syria shrank by 63% between 2010 and 2016 in real terms. And when you add them up year by year, the losses in GDP, you find that $226 billion in GDP losses in this period, which is about 4 times the pre-conflict GDP in Syria. And let me warn you at this point that when we published this report, certain media outlets picked that as the World Bank suggests $226 billion is required to rebuild the economy in Syria. But these are different concepts. So $226 billion is a backward-looking assessment. We look at what has been lost in terms of GDP, whereas the reconstruction is a forward-looking exercise. You try to come up with a number that gives you a reasonable path of recovery in the economy after the conflict. Those two concepts are not the same. So we do not suggest that this is the money that you will need to reconstruct the country. The second bucket of key results, the channels of transmission. So this is the area where we forced ourselves to think a bit out of the box. I mentioned the $226 billion losses between 2010 and 2017. The question here we are asking is, if we have this loss in economic activity, to what extent can we explain this with the casualties in the economy? What is the role of physical destruction in explaining the economic collapse in Syria? We know that the buildings in the media, you always, almost every day, you see the pictures from different cities showing the level of destruction. But to what extent that translates into the GDP losses, and what share of GDP losses can be attributed to that component? So for answering that question, we ran this thought exercise. We split factors that we can think of into 2 groups. One is above the water level, the other one is below. The above the water level are casualties and physical destruction. We call these effects the visible effects. These are very visible because it's easy to take a picture of it. It's easy to communicate through the media outlets, and it's easy to try to come up with a quantitative estimate of it, as we just did. But there is an invisible component. Here, you see we listed only 3 of them. Diminished social trust, disruptions in business networks and connectivity within economy, and increased rent seeking. So these things are not easy to observe, yet we know that they must have an effect on the economy itself as well. But to what extent? Is it a small effect? Is it a big effect? The surprising result in this report is they are much more important than physical destruction. So we see that 20% of the cities are gone, or 27 with the partial and total damages. But what we find is that the economic collapse in Syria is mainly about the disruptions in economic organization, or we call it economic disorganization. And I'm going to explain a bit more, but proportionately, these factors, these invisible effects in Syria's conflict-related outcomes has 20 times more important explanation power. So what we can safely say is that the visible effects of the destruction in Syria is only the tip of the iceberg. There's a large component of effects that we do not fully understand yet, but they have much more role in explaining the economic collapse. The next set of analysis we undertook is about, okay, I talked about these effects in Syrian economy, but how persistent are these effects? We know that GDP shrank by 63%. If the war to stop this year, would it rebound quickly? Or would Syria be confined to the low income level for the next few decades? What do we know about the possible recovery after conflict? And the interesting result we have here is that the longer the conflict continues, the more difficult it will be to get out of the conflict and get out of that low-income trap. More specifically, if the conflict were to end this year, in its 7th year, the GDP would recover 41% of the gap between current GDP and pre-conflict GDP in 4 years. But if the conflict ends in 10th year, we estimate that the recovery rate will be only 28%. The difference might look small, but when you accumulate them, in the first case, the GDP losses over 2 decades is 8 times the pre-conflict GDP, whereas in the second case, it's the 13 times the pre-conflict GDP. The difference is major. All right, so this was a snapshot of what we found in the report. I tried to avoid the technicalities. Now I'm going to go a bit more into technicalities to put some explanation how we came up with these numbers. This is Kobani just after ISIS was kicked out. So this is the slide that shows the physical damage estimates. We use the satellite images to observe the infrastructure damages in 10 cities, and these are listed here. And we classify the infrastructure into 6 categories: housing, water and sanitation, energy, transport, health, and education. And then we try to estimate the damages in each group, in each city. And the reason why we chose these 10 cities is, first of all, you have to make a selection because covering the entire Syria with satellite images is very time-consuming and very expensive. So we chose the 10 cities on the basis of numerous criteria. First, the conflict intensity. Second, the regional representation. Third, whether they are a good source or a good destination for IDPs. And then we extrapolated our estimates to governorate level. to 8 governorates, and here I report them. I'm not going to go into detail with the numbers. These are all in the report, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you have about this. So this was the northern governorates, and this is the southern governorates that we covered in the analysis. A bit more detail on the demographic and humanitarian outcomes. We know that the pre-conflict population in Syria was 20.7 million, and the latest estimates at the time we prepared the report were 18.8 million population within Syria. And the casualty mortality directly related to conflict, the estimates for that varied between 400,000, the UN estimate, and 470,000 SCPR estimates. The IDPs, again, there are differences between organizations' estimates. IOM suggests 5.7, UN OCHA suggests 6.3 million, and the difference is mainly about how they define the IDPs. And UNHCR reported in December 2016 about 4.8 million registered Syrian refugees. Two things that you need to be aware for careful people in the audience, these numbers don't add up. So when you take the 20.7 million in 2010 and the refugees and the current population, there are differences because first of all you need to in the fertility since 2010. So that population would be greater right now, and Syria had one of the highest fertility rates in the world before the conflict. And also there might be some double counting between the IDPs and the refugees because it's not possible to track every single individual. This is how we estimated the effect on GDP. The red line shows you the trajectory of the actual GDP in Syria in 2010 dollars. You see that right after the conflict, it takes a steep dive, and then over time, it continues to decrease, but not at the same pace. So I mentioned that there is 63% decrease in GDP, but that is not the impact. To understand the impact, you would have to think about what would happen to GDP without the conflict. And that's the light blue line or the gray line on top that you see. That shows us the counterfactual GDP estimate that we calculated based on some statistical methodologies. Happy to answer about it after the presentation. The difference between the two lines gives us the GDP losses. The yellow shaded area is the 226 billion. This is our poverty estimates. Unfortunately, we didn't have micro data from within Syria, so we had to come up with an estimate rather than reporting a number. We applied different methodologies. These are based on different elasticity of poverty with respect to income. And our most plausible case is the yellow line, where we suggest that the poverty increased to about, and this is extreme poverty, by the way, to about 63%. All right.
3 minutes.
Anyone wants to donate sometime? All right.
3 minutes and a half. That's allowed for.
But this is the most interesting part.
Okay.
All right.
4 minutes. That's it.
All right. So now we are going to work on these findings in different areas. Mm-hmm. And I told you that the overall economic impact is, just take the GDP number. Overall economic impact is what happened to GDP versus the counterfactual. And now we are asking, okay, if the overall economic impact is driven by labor, the shrinkage of labor, here the casualties, and then physical destruction, the collapse in capital, and then some sort of economic disorganization, which helps to bring the labor and capital together to produce. And we have a lot of different categories under this group, the economic disorganization. It could be the connectivity. It could be that the social trust between the employer and the employee. It could be rent seeking, many factors that goes into that. So how can we separate these three effects? Because the data does not tell us anything about it. What we did is we used an economic model. So this economic model, we built it to represent the Syria before the conflict. And it matches the dynamics of the Syrian economy and demography during the conflict as well. So what am I telling here? I'm telling you that we built a model which can replicate to what happened to GDP during the conflict, and which can replicate the gross migration between governorates within Syria and also the out migration from Syria. So the model is calibrated to actually capture all those effects, and when all shocks together, in this case, when all shocks hit together, our model replicates what happened to Syria. And then what we did is that we said, okay, now we have a model that's reliable. When all shocks are together, it explains what happened. Then let's introduce our shocks one by one. What if there was only casualties and nothing else, no physical destruction or economic disorganization? What would happen to GDP? Or the other way, what if there was only physical destruction? And this is what we did in the simulations, and these are numbers. I'm not going to go over them one by one, but here is the story. These red bars are what happened to Syrian economy up to today. We call it end of conflict. It's a wishful thinking. And what would happen to going forward? So when we introduce our shocks one by one, capital destruction, casualty, and economic disorganization, what do we see here? Economic disorganization by itself can explain much of the impact. Capital destruction, it has some impact, but it is minor. Not minor, but relatively small compared to the economic disorganization's effect. And counting on another 3 minutes from the moderator, I want to ask this question, why? So why do we think that the physical destruction's impact is so dominated by the economic disorganization? There are several explanations for this. Some of them are straightforward, some of them are not. The straightforward one can be explained with an example. Let's think like an economist and make assumptions. Assume that the Syrian economy was producing only bread, just bread, nothing else, okay? So you just need the ingredients of bread and you want to cook it. What do we need for baking bread? Flour, water, salt, yeast. Who said yeast? Are you from Lebanon or Syria? Because this morning we had a discussion. The Danish ambassador claimed that in this part of the world people don't use yeast. Apparently they do. So, and let's say maybe egg or whatever. So the question here is, assume that. So.
Use your time more efficiently.
Assume that suddenly in Syria the yeast producers are isolated. They cannot ship the yeast to the rest of the economy. And it might be because half of the yeast producers, the factories are destroyed. What would happen is that the bread production will cease, at least in the short term. In the long term, maybe you can produce breads without yeast, but in the short term, there will not be any bread production. So think about this. Only a small damage, half of yeast producers, which is a small cost compared to the other ingredients in the bread, but the impact is huge. So that disconnection of the yeast producers with the rest of the producers breaks the economic system, it breaks the value chain, and it translates into a huge economic outcome. Same story in Syria. What we observe is that in Hasaka, take for example, half of the city was controlled by one group and the other half was controlled by another group. That another group, the bread prices in between the two regions varied drastically. It was much cheaper in one group's territory than the other group's territory. Why? It's because that group maintained their supply chain with the rest of the countryside, whereas the other one didn't. So the access to supply chain can explain a lot. And this is one example. We calculated the actual kilometers you would need to take to go from city A to city B in Syria before the conflict and after the conflict. Before the conflict, let's say you had to take 100 kilometers to go from Hasakeh to Damascus. After the conflict, it's 16% higher. And it might be because the road is blocked, there might be some damage, a bridge might be damaged, or there might be some security checkpoint that you cannot go through. So both the physical damages and other type of connectivity issues translate into this the disconnectivity. And the highest of that was between Hasakeh and Deir ez-Zor, 42.6% increase in travel destination because you had to take the detours. So this translates into some supply chain problems. The next explanation is more abstract. And since we are talking about invisible things, I have to use some tools to communicate my point. And I want to use examples. So this is a situation where after a hurricane, the major highway of this town, which will remain unnamed, were flooded. The hurricane destroyed about 1,000 houses, significantly damaged about 17,000, and partially damaged about 30,000 houses here, and led to some sort of small number of casualties. So this is a good case of physical destruction only scenario. Okay, so not much casualty and not much institutional degradation or economic disorganization. What you see here is that the residents of that town lining up, this is about 2 kilometers of a line of trucks with boats in their back, in the trailer. They're voluntarily helping those who were stranded by flood water. I use this example to show that if there is no social trust issues or institutional degradation, probably this will be a relatively easy case to tackle. You can rebuild the damaged houses relatively quickly, and the society will not suffer from persistent damages. And I want to contrast that with another case. This little girl, her name is Adi Hudeya, and her father was killed in 2012 in Syria. And she was in the Atman refugee camp on the border with Turkey. When the photographer pointed his camera at her with a relatively long zoom lens, she thought that there was a weapon and she was about to be killed. And she surrendered to the camera. The story that I want to contrast in this case is that a conflict situation is different than a natural disaster. Here, there is no lingering social and psychological complications going on further. Once it's done, given especially that people were cooperative, it's done. Whereas in this case, it's a major problem. It cannot be treated as if it's a physical destruction. Your reconstruction scenario will be different between the first case and the second case. But the question is how? How should it be different? I think we are at the time, both as the World Bank and international community and also the general public, we are at the time we have to think about what is the implication of this one? How should we approach to reconstruction whenever that may take place? Now that we know these social effects have serious economic outcomes. Some of you are majors in probably pedagogy or social sciences. For you, this is not news. You always knew that these dimensions are much important. But what's news is that I'm telling you today, this is not only important because of the social sake, but it has serious economic consequences. So even if you have a politician that values the economy more than the social dimensions, you have an argument here. The social science, the social side of the conflict has a huge economic impact. That is the main driver of the economic collapse. Wrapping up, so the last scenario that I would like to briefly show is the persistence of the economic impact. As I mentioned, we compare the 7th and 10th year end scenarios, and here are the simulations. And the story again here is that the longer the conflict continues, the more difficult it will be to recover from that. One key note there is a straightforward component of this assessment. You can tell me that, hey, Harun Önder, thank you very much for that. We already knew it. If the conflict lasts longer, it will be, obviously, more damage will be done and it will be more difficult. But on top of that, what we are telling today is that on top of that straightforward component, even if the damage ratios remain the same, it will be much more difficult to get out of the situation because of several factors. The longer the kids stay out of the school, the more irreversible will be the situation. The longer the skilled workers remain out of the workforce, the less likely that they will go back to workforce. The more rent seeking in the economy that you have, the more rent seeking you will have, because people will not have productive options and they will go with the rent seeking activities. This is our report cover picture, and I'd like to just stop here. This is just a recap of what I mentioned. If you were to take 3 messages from this report, that would be Syrian conflict has generated a huge impact on economic and social outcomes. It has been the most devastating in the 21st century, probably, and one of the most important forced displacement cases since Second World War. The visible effects are only the tip of the iceberg. Focus on the invisible ones. That's where your success or failure will be defined in terms of reconstruction. And finally, the conflict should stop as soon as possible, otherwise it will be much more difficult for everybody to get back to normalcy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Harun. I'm sure the audience will have a lot of questions and comments, but before we open for discussion, Dr. Maha Mejia will comment on the presentation and on the report. Maha is the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center here in Beirut, where her work focuses broadly on political violence and identity politics, pluralism, development, and social justice after the Arab uprisings, challenges of citizenship, and the political and socio-economic implications of the migration or the refugee crisis. Prior to joining Carnegie, Maha had worked and led work on participatory development and social justice at the UN ESCWA, and she was previously regional advisor on social and urban policies at the ESCWA, and spearheaded strategic and intersectoral initiatives and policies in the Office of the Executive Secretary, which addressed, among others, the challenges of democratic transitions in the Arab world. So Maha will have around 10 minutes to comment on the study and on Harun's presentation.
Thank you, Nasser, and I'd like to begin by thanking the World Bank and IFI for having me with you today. I first want to start by congratulating Harun on the study and on the innovative methodology that was used to try and quantify some of these results, at least some of the toll of the conflict on Syria. What you've called the invisible impact, I would say, are very visible. Maybe they are not being quantified in the way you have done them, but they are incredibly visible. We live with the refugee crisis every day. We live with the war economy. We live with all the implications. They're just not being included in the discussion. I think the data provided does give us a good sense of what the toll of war, at least on some aspects of the Syrian conflict, and perhaps one can extrapolate from this in a follow-up the regional ripple effects of what is happening in Syria. I think
this is one of the lingering effects.
Yeah. This is the civil war, not the Syrian conflict. And the lack of reconstruction in this country, or the challenges of reconstruction in this country, I would say. I think also the data provided gives us really quite a good sense of the devastating impact of the conflict on Syria, but also on Syrian lives, as well on the prospects of rebuilding and reconstituting both the country and the lives of Syrian citizens. However, And this is where I come to, at least I have a couple of comments on the overall framework of the project. Where I had trouble were perhaps in a couple of areas. One, and they're both very significant in terms of understanding, not in terms of quantifying necessarily the conflict, but in terms of understanding how we got to where we are and what these imply for a post-war reconstruction, which is where you ended your presentation with. The report depoliticizes the conflict to some extent. It presents it as, there's a historic description of the triggers of conflict. At one point, it almost suggests, and I can show you later some quotes where it almost, you can see I read it thoroughly, where it almost suggests that the Arab uprisings triggered the devastating war in Syria to some extent. That there's an Arab uprisings mood, the regional context changed, and then the war happened in Syria. The war happened in Syria. This kind of a narrative ignores the kind of genuine grievances of people who were struggling for their freedom and who were calling for their rights, who were calling for social justice in a context like Syria. It doesn't explain why conflict happened in Syria and didn't happen in other parts of where Arab uprisings happened, for example, in Tunisia. I mean, the fact that different countries took different trajectories, I think, is very important for our understanding of what has happened in this region since 2011. But I think it also overlooks the fact that for the first 7 months of this uprising, it was an unarmed civilian uprising. It was unarmed, and I really have to emphasize this. This was a civilian uprising, and one reason that drove it towards becoming an armed conflict were the tactics of the regime, where it was the security clampdown of a regime that, at the very least, has been accused of major war crimes against its own people. I know the bank cannot say these things in its own report, but it cannot gloss over these things either and present it as a conflict that simply happened between two equal partners and that just came out of the blues. I think this is a very important, this is fundamentally important. I mean, it's not a question of nitpicking at the report, but this is fundamentally important for us to understand what a post-conflict scenario could look like if we link it to a political settlement and what that political settlement would look like. The other area I think that I had also trouble with is that, in addition to this, just to link it to this, the historic part of the report also that talks about, you end up with saying that without a comprehensive plan, there's going to be more rent-seeking and cronyism. Rent-seeking and cronyism were already were already one of the drivers of the conflict to start with, and this is one of the things that people were protesting against. So I think this is something also that we need to factor in when trying to understand how we got to where we got today. The other part also that I had some trouble with, and this is something that you see in throwaway sentences here and there, but also in the chapter that is trying to look, I believe it was chapter 2, that's trying to look at the history of Syria in about 5 pages or 10 pages. There is a historic narrative because in many ways the narrative is suggesting that the fault lines we see today, and I quote, correspond to ancient geographic and demographic fault lines. It talks about the policies of empire that tolerated, if not emphasized, sectarian ethnic differences, and so on and so forth. These kinds of statements not only betray perhaps a glossing over of the politics of empire. I mean, the Ottoman Empire went through an entire period of tanzimat where they were working on actually diminishing the ethnic and sectarian differences and were focusing on Ottoman citizenship. This is right before the mandate period. So I think these kinds of statements, for me, raise a red flag because they portray a sense that this kind of conflict is built on ancient hatreds between different sectarian and ethnic groups, Which is where actually while it doesn't say, we don't talk about ancient hatreds in the report, we end up at the very end of the report talking about the fact that the sectarian aspect of the conflict is perhaps the most significant and the most lingering. And this is where, I can show you where it is. This is where I would have a big issue. To my mind, the sectarian aspects of the conflict is something, a kind of address that was put over is a political conflict. This is a political issue. Let's not make any mistake about it. If we want to talk in crude, pure sectarian terms, the population of Syria today is made out of 70 to 80% Sunni. A large portion of those that escaped, of the internal displaced people, are Sunnis that were displaced from one part of Syria to government-held areas. Many Sunnis were displaced from areas that were held by ISIS. So the sectarian aspect of the conflict has really been used by the regime and by others to justify some of the some different aspects of the war as it is developing. This is a political issue where identity politics are being used, and these have also significant implications for the post-war reconstruction and the post-war settlement scenarios for Syria. I mean, one throwaway statement was, again, the Hafez al-Assad and his son have never won anything less than 99% of the vote. I was almost, this sort of completely ignores the kind of machinery that was pushing for results like this and the context under which Syrians were living in and why the uprising began to start with. So I've talked a bit about the sectarian conflict. The second aspect, I think, of the conflict, and you did address some of it here, which is the considerable territorial fragmentation and the emerging war economy. I would have actually liked to see a lot more about, beyond the fact that, and I like very much this ability now to quantify and say, supply chains have been broken, and this has increased economic costs. However, the implications are far beyond this. We are talking about different war economies or war economy regimes that have emerged in different zones of influence. Today, Syria is at least under 5 different zones of influence. The de-escalation plan that is being implemented by the Russians mainly, but in bilateral agreements with the Americans in one place and the Turks in another and the Egyptians in another, is actually re-emphasizing this kind of territorial fragmentation and probably the continuation of this kind of economic fragmentation as well. The main concern here is that in this kind of a scenario and with the shape of the political settlement that seems to be in play, the real concern is if and when reconstruction happens, if we go in blindly, or at least if we go in assuming that reconstruction is mainly a technical issue, to end up reinforcing the kind of cronyism that you are worried about, because the only local entities that will be allowed to operate are those that are sanctioned by the regime. It means that most of the reconstruction funding is going to happen in the areas that are under the direct control of the regime and where the regime wants the funding to go. It means that the areas that are most marginalized in Syria will continue to be the most marginalized in Syria. I think these are significant issues that need to be put on the table when we're talking about what are the implications of all of this for a post-conflict rebuilding, reconstruction, stabilization. I mean, now we're in the phase where we're using very different words because the international community is at a loss to explain how can it talk about post-war reconstruction or post-conflict reconstruction when a political transition has not taken place and where it may have to live with a regime that has been accused of war crimes against its own population. I'll make one last point, which is also, again, about the implications. If I take, for example, the issue of housing damages, and this is obviously will be a big issue in terms of the reconstruction and the rebuilding. The absolute numbers are frightening. What is interesting is that we've been doing a project for the past almost year with refugees in Lebanon and in Jordan, trying to understand what are their triggers of return to Syria. One of the issues that is not popping up is housing. And it's not popping up not because it's not important, it is important to them. But for them, the political settlement and the security and safety of and their ability to move around their country is far more significant than whether their house is intact or not. The statement we keep hearing, we'll go pitch a tent and rebuild our own home. What they're looking for is the ability to go back to an area that is safe for them to return to, and where they are guaranteed that they will not be persecuted, that they will not be kidnapped, that the local goons, the shabiha on the ground, will not be coming after them. We can go into more details about this. On the housing issue, also last but not least, I think, and again, just to pull it out a little bit more, one of, I think, the biggest issues with the housing is not the amount of housing that needs to be rebuilt and reconstructed. 42% of housing in Syria prior to the conflict was informal. The main concern today is what is going to happen, and we're already seeing indications in Hama and Aleppo and in Damascus, where the regime is going in and raising large informal settlements to the ground, making it impossible for people to go back to their homes. So what do you do with these people who no longer have homes to go to, not because it was damaged by the war, but because they have been raised as part of post-war reconstruction and property developments? Another area, again related to the housing issue, is that there's going to be multiple, because people left barely with their clothes on. Many don't have title deeds. Some do, some don't. What is going to happen to these people when they go back home and there's going to be claims and multiple claims on their properties? This is going to put an incredible strain on the legal system. So supporting the legal system has direct implications for any kind of reconstruction and rebuilding. Supporting the legal system is part of rebuilding trust and the bonds of trust in communities within Syria. All of this to say is that I think it's very important for us to be able to quantify and talk about the less talked about or less examined aspects. I haven't talked about the need for transitional justice and what that means. I haven't talked about, there's a broad range of issues that are fundamental if we are going to talk about a post-conflict sustainable political settlement where reconstruction can actually happen and in a sustainable manner, in a long-term manner. Where we will not see conflict erupt in the next, 5 years. Honestly, I'm a bit less optimistic about this scenario, given the way the winds are blowing. I think what we're looking at is actually different zones of influence under these de-escalation zones. The regime today will stay until further notice, until he stopped I don't want to mix between the figure of the president and the regime itself, but until things change, at least on the international level. However, this is not the same regime that was pre-2011. It no longer has the financial resources nor the human resources to be able to regain control over all of Syria. The idea that we're going to have a central state that will be able to manage all of this process, or that we are going to have a Marshall Plan even for Syria, I think is a pipe dream. So I think it's these kinds of things that we need to put on the table when we're talking about post-conflict reconstruction, and then try and understand what the implications of the numbers that you've put on the table mean for how do we then go about it and what the implications are. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go directly to the. Thank you, Maha. Thank you, Haroon, for the presentation. Thank you, Sarouj, for giving the overview early in the panel. We'll have like 30 minutes plus for discussions and questions and answers. The way we do it, we take 3 or 4 questions at a time. Please introduce yourself briefly and ask a question, and or just a quick comment rather than do another presentation. So we want to take as many questions as possible. I don't know where are the microphones. They are around. Okay. Okay. Who would like to go first? No?
What is one person?
Yes, yeah, we'll get the microphone here. The microphone, please. Great, thanks. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Abdussalam Sid Ahmed, UN Human Rights. I have a simple question, although the answer may not be simple, about the war economy. I don't know if the report has touched on that or tried to analyze the war economy. I guess that is an important aspect to look at, even looking back on the 5 years of the conflict. Now, the second question already Maha touched a bit on the whatever the concept we would like to have about reconstruction. But let us assume that the Syrian government currently already thinking about reconstruction, I presume. Let us assume that they ask the World Bank about their advice about reconstruction. What advice will you give them? Thank you.
Very good. More questions? Yes, please, here in the middle. Muhammad, one in the middle. Please. Yes.
Hi, Rasil Barado, Human Rights Watch.
Sorry?
Rasil Barado, Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch.
So this is a question for Maha Mejia. Thank you for your insight. Can you talk to us a little bit more about the process of property rights and how the international community can prevent multiple claims to property? And in that light, and taking into account other kind of security considerations, what it means for refugees to be leaving Lebanon in the kind of framework of course migration.
Good. And question over there, and we'll take the answers.
Hi, thank you so much. Dina Raji, Crisis Action. Hi. So my question is for Dr. Maha Mejia. Can you please elaborate more on how to regain trust when it comes to the legal system and improving it for the people who want to, for the returns of the refugees and the people who want to return back to Syria? Thank you. I don't know if that was clear, but okay. I would, if it wasn't clear, I would elaborate.
Okay. Shall we take these, Haroon? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I will try and answer your question on reconstruction advice.
Okay.
So we don't have any request from anyone at this time to give any advice. But just so that you know, the World Bank's the name actually is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It was set up as a reconstruction institution after the World War II. So globally, we've been engaged in about 600 and now the count may be about 700 post-conflict, post-disaster, post-crisis reconstruction worldwide. And the most important lesson we have learned is that put people at the center of the entire reconstruction program. And the programs were, for example, what we did in Aceh after the tsunami in Indonesia, where essentially a more community-led recovery and reconstruction program pretty much was the foundation for everything to happen in the country. So no matter which part of the world you're talking about, if you put people at the center of the initiative, it would work. So that would be our advice to anyone. The second point I want to make is that, and I just want to be absolutely clear, I said this in the beginning and I want to be absolutely clear, is that the report that the World Bank Group has done is not looking at any issues before the conflict. It does not suggest anything that needs to be done based on this report after the conflict at this time. It is only looking at what has really happened during the conflict. It has a very narrow scope, but it provides a good contribution to the ongoing research by different think tanks, institutions globally in terms of what we really know about the conflict and how it can provide an evidence base for anything that's happening about that country today. Clearly, I think the report has a message that there is an urgency for all the stakeholders to find a resolution, because the human consequences as well as the socioeconomic impact is catastrophic. So I'll let Harun respond to the question that we had on war economy.
That's a very short answer, no. We didn't look into war economy because of the limitations of available sources on that. And there's a reason why there has been very little done on it, given the limitations of reliable information. But we, just like any other audience, we investigated on the reported anecdotes, and we cite some of that in the report, but these are very, very small.
Okay, great. Maha?
Just very quickly on the issue of housing and property rights, you wanted to know a bit more about this issue. As I was saying, 42% of housing in Syria prior to the conflict were informal settlements. So people didn't have actually any. Informal settlements means either they were they built housing on land that belonged to the government or to a mashah that belonged to the village, or there were different kinds of property regimes. This creates what is known as a kind of illegal pluralism. It becomes accepted. There are different property regimes operating within these settlements that are acceptable to most people. And what guarantees these regimes usually is the community. So they accept that, I'm renting from so-and-so, and this piece of paper says I'm renting, and I bought this house from so-and-so. They may not be registered with the cadastre, but they're accepted. The significance of this in a post-war reconstruction effort is that if the international community decides to focus on the cadastre and only the formal framework of rebuilding, then this is going to place a large portion of Syrians in a very precarious situation because their housing, to start with, was not formal. So I think this is something that needs to be seriously taken into account. On the issue of coerced return, and I actually wrote a policy brief not too long ago that talks about how a political settlement has to be refugee-centered, where the issue of the rights of not only refugees but also internally displaced have to be taken into account and be part of whatever political settlement is put in play, including the issue of housing and the return to areas of origin and source. There are many things we can talk about. The issue of coerced return is very much on the table, and there is a lot of concern. The push and pull factors, many of the refugees that came to Lebanon, a minor portion were economic migrants, but the majority fled fighting. They fled the conflict, they fled barrel bombs, they fled all sorts of horrific conditions. They are unable to go back. Many of the refugees would love to go back, but they are simply unable to go back, and the reasons are too many. But just one to just give you an idea, 21% of the refugees in Lebanon, another 21% come from the Homs and Hama and Aleppo and Homs governorates. Many are unable to go back, either because they don't have homes to go back to, or because they're afraid of the security situation, they're wanted by the regime, and there are many. Pushing people back into this environment is actually placing them in a much more vulnerable situation. The returns that have happened so far as part of peace deals in Arsal and in the north have actually simply pushed the problem from one place to the other. Many of those people have returned to Idlib, which is most likely going to be the next site of a major conflict. So these people have been pushed from one precarious situation to another. And I think this is something that, again, the international community has to be very wary of and maybe hands-on about. The issue of trust in the legal system and how to rebuild it, this, again, has to be part of the political negotiations. There are different levels where this would happen. There's at the level of the macro political negotiations that would be happening, where a political settlement is being hammered out. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done at the local level. There are trusted actors, there are community-based organizations that can play a role in supporting the legal system. A transitional justice mechanism has to be put in place, which could include also support for the legal system. Surprisingly, people haven't lost faith in the legal system in Syria. When you talk to them, they still, they still believe in some of the traditional, i.e. going back to their tribal leader to resolve conflicts, or to the actual courts. There are judges that are still highly respected. But the actual system itself, this I think will have to be dealt with really at the middle and micro level. But the system itself has to be, there has to be a large influx of trained judges or alternative mechanisms put in place to resolve disputes, whether they're based on community organizations, community structures, mediators who are trusted by different sides. I think we need to look at a broad range of mechanisms that could allow this to sort of kick up and take off.
Very good. Okay, another round. Okay, we have. Let's start. Let's start with Dr. Wahid, and then we'll go up. We'll walk through the stairs. Please, Iman.
Thank you. I'm Iman Wahid. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, but I'm serving currently as one of the co-chairs for the Lancet AUB Commission on Syria, and we're looking at the sort of the health issues regarding that. So I have a set of questions, if you allow me, Nasser. One of the issues that we're facing in the commission is the numbers, the figures, as you rightly mentioned. So how did you decide on the figures, on the numbers that you've used in your report, and what is that sort of confidence weight that we have to attach to these numbers when we're reflecting on them, citing them, and using them? My second question to you, Haroon, is when we look at the invisible, I'm sure that education is, and the sort of this whole concept of the lost generation came into it. So methodologically, how did you quantify that whole concept of lost generation and education with what Maha has posed to all of us? And if you allow me to Maha, one of the challenges that, again, even in our commission looking at health, is this multi-layered sort of fault lines. You're talking about within the country, and you've laid out all these sort of fault lines within the country and the challenges, but then you're talking about the region as a whole, and then internationally. So when we talk about an international community, sort of some kind of an international justice or whatever, whom are we talking about, and what are we talking about? So that's sort of the layers of this division from the local up to the international community.
Very good. Okay, let's go this way, Muhammad, our colleague up, and then we'll come back.
Samar Al-Adi from the Arab Weekly newspaper. My question is addressed to Dr. Maha. From your presentation, we can understand that at the core of any reconstruction or any economic growth in Syria, we have to focus first on what kind of political settlement we have to reach to facilitate this reconstruction. So if we see at the situation today, and if that's the criteria for reconstruction, we might be looking for a longer, longer conflict, or a reconstruction that will be delayed for a few years, right? I mean, how do you see it?
Very good. Please. More or less, okay. Over there, please. Yeah. And then
Hi, Julian Fearling, exchange student from Sciences Po. I have a question in your simulated poverty rate with and without the conflict simulation. Well, the counterfactual simulation says that poverty will actually go down, would have gone down between the beginning of the conflict and now. A number of researchers have pointed out that prior to the conflict, from 2006 to 2010, there was a massive drought in the northeastern region of Syria, leading to a massive, flight from land to urban areas and almost skyrocketing of urban unemployment. Does this figure in the poverty rates at all or not?
Okay, and last question in this round, and then we'll come back to this. Yes, please.
Hi, Daniel Pimlott. I work for Adam Smith International. We've been running programming in Syria since about 2013. I just wondered if how the World Bank was looking at how it might do programming in Syria during the reconstruction in a way that would be able to adequately incorporate the opposition-held areas and the DEZs, and in a way that didn't sort of undo some of the changes that have happened in those areas during the war, and whether there were particular models for reconstruction that you look at in a situation where there are very radically detached parts of a territory, such as has happened during this war.
Okay, let's answer these, and then we'll take another round. Harun, would you like to go? We have a couple of questions for you.
All right, so the numbers on the reliability on numbers. I mean, obviously there's a question of which number is reliable or missing, and we use the numbers that by looking at, first of all, if we can have the access to methodology to see if the methodology is sound. The estimated numbers are generated by using a sound methodology. In certain cases, we didn't use them. And obviously, it's very difficult to verify the numbers because either they vary and it's difficult to have the core data. And in those cases, we had to rely on either the methodological assessment or the credibility of the other studies produced by either that person or agency. So we had to use some judgment. The loss generation, methodologically, how did we quantify it? In the report, we have some assessment of human capital loss over generations, and it's a small component because the methodology that we used, the underlying data was not sufficiently high quality, so we used a simple back-of-the-envelope calculations just to give a taste of what it could be. So we report that in the second chapter of the report. Under, I can find a page note, but later. On the poverty into simulations, so the latest data we had for poverty in table 1 and 1, we report that was 2007. This was the latest reported one. I think it overlaps to a certain extent with the drought period, but the drought was longer than that, so in a way you would anticipate some of the additional impact coming into consideration, but this is a data that we could not observe, thus we couldn't incorporate that.
Okay.
On the issue of, by the way, there's a new report that came out today, yesterday, I think, by UNICEF, talking precisely about the amount of children. I think it's something like 3.6 million children who have not had 1 day of school yesterday, in the past year, in 2016. So the numbers are quite significant. And actually, it would be wonderful. It would be interesting to try and calculate, maybe at a later stage, what that means in terms of loss of, in terms of employability, so on and so forth, down the road. Just on the issue of the actors and who are we talking about from the local to the international, you asked. When I talk about the international community, I mean, there are different kinds of international communities. There's the international community, there is international organizations, the United Nations, so on and so forth, even the EU, who will be effectively involved in the rebuilding and reconstruction of among others. I mean, this is a long discussion. I think the two questions are connected anyway. It's a long discussion of who will effectively finance the rebuilding and reconstruction of Syria. And I think when I'm referring to the international community, in a way I'm referring to these actors or to these players. did I say something I shouldn't say? The international community. It's a moral fine line. I know, for example, many in the EU are grappling with the idea of, okay, we know that there needs to be stabilization in certain areas, and that's why they've moved away from talking about post-war reconstruction to talking about stabilization. However, how can we do this in a context where we know that anything we put into these areas is effectively reinforcing the regime by reinforcing its local goons on the ground? It's a moral dilemma many will be grappling with, and many of us are grappling with, in terms of, do you maintain the moral high ground and say, no, we will not do this, and continue to see people suffering? Or do you say, no, there are certain things that can be done, however, we need to put certain checks and balances in place and make sure that they are operational, maybe put certain conditionalities to make sure that the dividends of reconstruction are more evenly spread. At the regional level and the political settlement, that's a different ballgame. There, the scenario that I'm seeing evolve and develop, and this again has an impact. I'm not saying that, I mean, economic reconstruction will happen in whatever scenario that is agreed on, political settlement. Even in the current sort of scenario that is happening, which is these kinds of bilateral, multilateral arrangements in the south with the Jordanians and the Americans and the Israelis to some extent, in the middle with the Egyptians and the Syrian regime, and in the north with the Turks. I mean, there are different arrangements. Economic reconstruction will begin, and we will see some economic life re-emerging. Some of it will reinforce existing, all the war economy, all the networks that emerged during the conflict. Others may emerge, they will reinvigorate economic life at the local level. However, this means that we're not going to see any kind of, this is what I was driving at, that in this current scenario, we're not going to see a Marshall Plan for Syria. We're not going to see a kind of this overall vision that says, this is where we want Syria in 10 years. This is how we're going to go about it. This is how we're going to make sure that the peace settlement that is in place is going to be a sustainable one. And there will not be, and that the dividends of this reconstruction will actually be evenly spread. This is not an ideal scenario. I mean, this is something that can happen, give or take. But this is not where we're going today. The Astana Agreement, to my mind, has voided Geneva. The fact that Assad is staying has also voided Geneva. We're no longer talking about political transition. We're talking about different kinds of arrangements. So then, in this kind of scenario, what is it that can be done, and what kind of reconstruction? And that's the real question. What kind of reconstruction can effectively happen?
Okay.
I think I've sort of answered both questions at the same time.
Very good. We'll move to this part, please. Mohammed al-Bayan. We'll start with our and then we'll come, downstairs, and we'll go again. Okay. We'll try to make as many as possible in this round. Perhaps this is the last round, but as you see, we have kind of, I'm in the middle between the economic, trying to be as neutral as possible, and then the political analysis, which is giving in a lot of the reality. So try to come up with new questions, perhaps, too. So please, come in.
Thank you very much. My name is Gaia Pellegrini Bettoli. I'm an Italian journalist, and I live in Beirut. I'll try to make it quick to give everyone a chance to also ask their questions. The more I interview refugees here and the more I speak with experts, the comment that I hear more and more often is, this is not a civil war, this is a war on civilians. And on this comment, for the panelists that are highly involved with statistics and reports, I'd like to ask if there's any document or research study that has been launched to measure the price of civilians on the embargo. I'm referring, for example, to cancer patients. Because chemotherapy is described as dual-use material, actually getting chemotherapy in Syria right now is extremely difficult. Thank you very much.
Very good. Yeah, we'll take the round here. Who's, no, our colleague here, please. And then we'll go up to
hello, thank you very much for very interesting presentations and for interesting comments. My name is Atajanis Morodov, and I work United Nations. I have basically two questions. One of them related to the confliction zones, because it was mentioned that they are not perfect. They're dividing the country into 5 zones. So, and kind of following this logic, Was it a mistake made kind of by Americans, Russians, kind of Turkish kind of governments, kind of Iranians? So was it a mistake? Should be kind of these confliction zones abandoned for the kind of higher moral ground, and then Syria returned to the previous kind of developments? And second question, it's about again no assistance, kind of no rebuilding of the country until political agreement is reached. So under the name of this again abstract moral ground, but shall people suffer? Shall people of Syria suffer because of lack of economic development, because of the crisis, in the name of this abstract moral ground? Thank you very much.
Okay, please.
Abla Qadi, University for Senior, ex-UNICEF. My question is, you have indicated the damage on hospitals and on schools. Do you have any information about the factories and the damages that occurred on that? The second question is, from your experience, is it true that usually only 20% of displaced people go back to their areas? And the third question is, do you have any idea the mines that have been planted, how widely spread are and how dangerous they are? Thank you.
Very good. Philippe?
Hello, my name is Philippe Sheet. I'm from UNESCO. My question is related to informality in the Syrian economy. Before, the Syrian economy has not informal economy. And the war, the crisis has increased this into areas, new areas, and has created people working for non-economical reasons, you know, like selling water, things that are not very countable in the GDP. So in the report, they didn't tackle this, and it should be part of, and in the model also, and also it will have very great implication on reconstruction, as people are involved in that.
Very good, and our colleague standing, and then we'll take another round, please.
Hi, my name is Jamie Balfour. I'm a humanitarian magician. I work with Magic for Smiles, Magic for kids, refugee kids mainly. I had a crystal ball question, possibly more from Maha, but anyone else, about there's some small parts of the media and even the UN talking about the rebels are defeated and the conflict is basically coming to an end. There's a debate on whether that's victory or not, and certainly sustainable peace is the point that the UN is particularly making. I just wondered if anyone had a comment on the scenario. Is it coming to an end in terms of violence or not?
Okay, let's answer these, and then we'll have a final round. Haroon, would you like to?
Thank you. These are excellent questions. On the healthcare related casualties, again, we didn't have primary data, but we came across with studies that shows that the indirect effects of the conflict in terms of the mortality could be even higher than the direct effects. So the mortality numbers that we reported in 2014, there was a study by an independent researcher who suggested that the lack of healthcare access might have led to more casualties than actually the direct effect of the conflict. But we did not have the means to look at the geographic distribution of this one. On factories, we actually wanted to do that, trying to see to what extent the factories have been damaged. But there were technical challenges by looking at the satellite images. Within industrial zones, since we know that they are industrial zones, we could look at the damages. I think in Aleppo we did a couple of cases there. But within cities, it was a bit difficult to separate between the types of infrastructure, so we couldn't do a detailed assessment of that. On the informality in the economy, yes, I mean, this is a factor that we are very well aware of. Again, with so much to do, but so little time and so little data available. Hopefully, UNESCO was one of our main partners. Where we received the data on economic activity. So maybe you can tell us on that. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Maha, briefly.
The deconflictual zones should be abandoned for some high moral ground. I wasn't claiming that. What I was describing was the fact that the deconflicting zone, the escalation zones, replaced Geneva, and they devoided Geneva. If you're looking for a short-term fix and just to reduce the level of violence, it's a good strategy. If you're looking for a medium to long-term sustainable peace, for not only Syria but for the region, no, it's not a good strategy. And actually, a lot of refugees, it links to the question about how many people do end up going back. We don't have percentages. I don't like getting into percentages of how many, but everything indicates is that people are very wary to go back in this kind of scenario because they perceive it as a fragmentation and a breaking up of Syria. In terms of rebuilding, should people suffer while we wait for this? Again, this wasn't what I was saying very explicitly, is that we need to take into account what happens when we stabilize in this kind of a context and make sure that there are frameworks that prevent the local goons on the ground and the regime proxies from gaining unnecessarily from the rebuilding and reconstruction process. At no point did I say we need to just, make people suffer some more. So I think, I hope that's clarified. Just one last thing, is this mini scenario the end of, are we seeing the end of the conflict? I don't believe so. I think what we're seeing is a stabilization and deconflicting. I think we still have quite a while to go, in all honesty. And even if the regime was to regain territorial control of all of Syria, I believe we're going to continue seeing insurgencies flare up here and there because there is no comprehensive and there is no sustainable peace settlement in place that actually takes into account why this began in the first place. And now it's become far more complicated with all the different actors and all the different interests that are dominating the Syrian conflict today.
Very good. So, yes, let's start. A lot of need to be okay with our. Yes, okay. You asked a question.
Yes, but I have another one.
No, I think we should give to other managers.
All right.
Let's give it to give the chance that we're not.
Hello, my name is Lucy McNeese. I'm a retired professor from the University of Connecticut. I'm now at the National Institute for Oriental Civilizations in Paris. My question, first to say to Maha Mejia, I applaud your insistence on the political nature of the conflict and the history. My question has to do with the present and future role of Lebanon. Not only above and beyond important discussions, academic discussions, of which AUB is responsible for so many, but and not only in relation to the return of the refugees, but how do you envision the future of Lebanon in relation to this conflict and a lasting peace, if possible, in the Middle East? Thank you.
Okay, please, quick standing, and then we will. And then we'll.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ahmed Sheikh Abed from UNESCO. Actually, my question to Harun regarding that, we know there is maybe direct impact of the conflict actually on the economic direct impact, but we know also that Syria was subject to unilateral measures from the Western countries, like economic sanctions, and those actually has added up to the impact of the conflict actually on Syria. Businessmen says that maybe that these sanctions adding about 30 to 40% on the transaction on the transaction cost actually in doing business in Syria. Apart from, the complications that being creating a climate of fear actually impacting on finance. My question actually, did you take into account in your relative catching up scenarios, the influence of sanctions, whether will be sustained or lifted, and this also lead to a broader question about whether you made assumptions on external financing for post-conflict situation on the scenarios that you made on at the ending of the conflict, 7 years or 10 years. Thank you.
Very good. Okay. Yeah. Let's go around Muhammad, where the hands are. Yeah, but very briefly, please. We need to close in 5 minutes.
Hello.
I'm Bilal Hussein. I work on a Syria peace building program. I just wanted to ask, like, you were talking about the reconstruction of Syria, but we were talking about who will finance the reconstruction without asking who will implement this reconstruction. Will it be the regime? Will it be like kind of the financial support of the regime for the future, or will it be like the war criminals? Will the same war criminals as what was done in Lebanon like a couple of years ago, or would we repeat the same mistake, or will we do like a kind of a real conflict mapping, and we'll check what was the real factors or that pushed into this conflict, and then we'll work accordingly. Thank you.
Very good. Yes.
My name is Morgana Salvador. I am a master's student. My question is regarding to the return. So without an actual peace agreement, I would like to know, like, because for many people there is this idea that there are safe zones in Syria where people could go and they should be able to settle, but what is the proper assessment that should be done in order to say that an area is actually safe? And I would like to understand this also in terms of the economical dimensions of it.
Very good. Who's next? Yeah, please, on the first row.
Hi, I just have a quick question that is connected to the question of the professor from Connecticut. Basically, how can we imagine that there will be projects of reconstruction and economic growth with the same political ambiguity that is created right now? Is it possible that that Syria would actually rise with the same political ambiguity that is existent right now?
Okay, good. Please, there, sitting, and then we'll come to our colleague here, and then we'll end with you. Fadal.
Tanya Kisali, a very practical question. What recommendations would you have for those of us in the room who are practically thinking ahead and planning our contribution? On the one hand, we're talking about rebuilding the local markets. On the other hand, we've got economic sanctions. How would you recommend, or what is the thinking currently about the practicalities of this, coming from an international community perspective?
Okay, great. Muhammad. And then we'll end with...
My name is Amar Matar. I'm with the Asfari Institute, and my question is for Harun primarily. And I wanted to know if, in the scenarios used in the report, there was a consideration for the former united Syrian economy becoming permanently regionalized, where trade and supply chains, for instance, radiated out of the major cities, and if that either increased or decreased the time it took for the former GDP or former size of the Syrian economy to redevelop again.
Okay. And last but not least.
Hello, my name is Magali. The questions are kind of linked with the other ones. So you said that we needed people to be able to settle for a political solution, but what people are talking about, because now the only, let's say, official and recognized identity or entity in Syria would be the regime. And second, it was concerning the role of Lebanon and especially the community-based organizations and NGOs. How could they contribute to a better peace settlement in Syria, and at the same time work on the community-based problems in Lebanon itself? Thank you.
Okay, great. So, Harun, briefly.
Okay, so
a lot of questions
yeah,
on
the
future.
I'll let the political questions. Maha is handling them very well. So
but that's a big issue.
That's a cop-out, Harun.
So I'll stick to what I know, which is my report. So the sanctions, we are aware of that in economic, from a theoretical point of view, they should have an impact, but we didn't have the methodological approach to actually measure this. These are, from a very technical point of view, the data is very limited, like 6 years, and then it's almost impossible to estimate econometrically what would it mean. So what, in a way, our economic disorganization scenario encapsulates all effects that are not measured by labor and capital. So yes, they are there, but we don't know how much are they. All right. Do we assume external financing on post-war recovery? No. In this report, there is no reconstruction effort, nothing. This is entirely economy's own regeneration capacity. Take a building and workers, so the factory is here, workers are here, factory is damaged, workers might be killed or not. So this is this framework that we are looking into. But going back to the security-related question, in our example, the factory is not damaged, the workers are not hurt, but they cannot get out and go to the factory because there is security threat. So what happens is that once the conflict ends, the security threat is gone, and the workers can go back to factory, which rekindles the economy to a certain extent. But with all the damage, the economy doesn't go back to its pre-conflict capacity. But in this report, we did not undertake any simulations on reconstruction. On safe zone, that's the only one that I want to get out of my report and just give a very practical answer. Economists would say that just like any other measurement or price, there's a very, very good measurement of this. Ask people. If they say it's safe, it's safe. If they say it's not safe, it's not safe. You cannot know better than them. So that's typically the economist's approach. And on the regionalized economy, again, this is something, this is a forward-looking assessment, and we didn't do this formally, but since our model captures the demographic flows across governorates and also the movement of business from governorate to governorate, it in a way captures the regional separations in economic activity, but we didn't do this on a formal basis by looking at if we divide the economy into 3 pieces. That we did not do. Very good.
Quickly, I'll start with the returnees safe zones. Safe zones are safe for a while. They're safe today, could be unsafe tomorrow. And this is the understanding that most refugees we've talked to have. They know that it could be declared safe tomorrow, but then tomorrow something will change. So I think the idea of safe zones is not necessarily the way forward in terms of refugee return. On the implications on Lebanon, and I'll try and address both questions at the same time, I think obviously the shape of the settlement in Syria will have considerable implications on Lebanon, and I'll just mention a couple of them. Most important, obviously, is the role of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is heavily implicated in the conflict in Syria. So depending on what shape, what kind of political settlement is put in place in Syria and what role Iran is playing in that settlement will have direct implications on whether Hezbollah's role expands or contracts. Many people assume that Hezbollah will return immediately after whatever settlement is put in place. I personally don't think so. I think the regime continues to need Hezbollah, and Hezbollah will want to capitalize on its investment in Syria over the past so many years. So I don't see that. Perhaps of more concern in the immediate term, in terms of the implications for the future of Lebanon, is the Hezbollah-Israel detente. There has been a lot of considerable, an up in the ante and in the discussion of a potential conflict in the near future. This could be in 1 year, 2 years. But there's definitely a shift in the discussion that we're seeing in a very palpable manner. Again, this can be, and part of it has to do with the fact that the Israelis are very unhappy with the increasing role of Iran and Hezbollah in Syria and feel that now they're being surrounded. This is from the Israeli perspective. So I think there needs to be for this not to take place, a lot more needs to be put in place that would mitigate the potential of such a conflict taking place. And this can only take place as part of a regional and international settlement. This is not a bilateral issue at all. If a lasting political settlement is put in place in Syria, this obviously will have very positive repercussions on Lebanon. On the economic front, many Lebanese are gearing up for participating in the reconstruction. There are lots of these, ongoing discussions of turning Tripoli into a port. There will be some benefits for Lebanon, I think, on that front. I don't know the extent to which these benefits will happen, but there are already some tangible benefits, at least at that level. Our colleagues from the IFC maybe will have other ideas, or the World Bank, but there is discussion on that front. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Very good. Any final word?
No, I think it's been a very rich discussion, and as we all know, this is a very complex situation. But just on the limited mandate that the World Bank Group has to try and continue understanding the social and economic consequences, many of the feedback that you've given, I think it will feed into our new work program. We will work with some of the think tanks in the region, take the research work forward. We are very much connected with the international community's ongoing discussions in Geneva and elsewhere. And as and when there is a settlement, being part of the broader multilateral system, the World Bank Group will be asked to play a role. And we will do what we normally do in situations around the world. Each situation is very different, so I think when we engage in a situation, it is shaped by what is the settlement, what is expected by the international community of the World Bank Group, and that's what exactly we'll do. I just wanted to add a word on role of Lebanon in the region. I think Lebanon can play an extremely important role in the region. In its position, its location is such that it can really provide, I would say, an opportunity for more economical trade and transit for many countries in the region as well. We've already started looking at some of the regional issues along with UNESCO colleagues. We should really look at more regional economic cooperation programs. I think we can find issues on which countries can work together. And I think we should already start looking at it. Reconstruction, when it happens, will of course be a great opportunity for Lebanon, for Jordan. We are working with the government on a number of issues relating to that. Maha mentioned some of those. But I also think we got to start really looking at the whole transportation network of Lebanon, its connectivity with the other countries in the region, looking at basically what the broader 15 to 20-year trade scenario will look like. And we're working on some of those issues with the organized institutions. So I think Lebanon is strategically very well placed to really benefit from all that is going to happen in the region. It's also on the Silk Road, as you know, initiative of China. So I think there are opportunities coming its way from many parts, and I think we need to capitalize on this. And two things there: good investment climate, good education. I think these two things will play an extremely important role. Well, thank you very much.
And good governance, I think we need also to. So with this note, I'd like to thank my colleagues for really great presentations and discussion. But I want to tell you to stay tuned to what AUB is doing this academic year. Dean Wahid mentioned the AUB Lancet Commission on Syria. I think the report should be towards the end of this year. And next year, sorry.
Has one more year to go.
May 2018, a lot of work happening on refugees. The institute here is also, taking a lot of work on the refugee question, as well as other faculties and schools in AUB. So stay tuned to a lot of these activities on Syria and the Syria question. And thank you so much for coming. But join me to thank my colleagues.
Thank you.